Hey guys, this is Voxide and welcome to another After Effects tutorial. So before I get started, I just want to extend a big shout out to a friend of mine that just got into motion graphics recently. This tutorial is actually based off of a technique that he came up with, so a huge thanks to him. And actually, if you want to follow his Video Hive portfolio, I will leave this link in the description of the video so you can follow him. Definitely keep an eye out for this guy. And another thing is I will be using my utility box script. So utility box is a free script that I've created, and you can download it free from my website. And everything you need to know about how to install it is already here in this page. So if you want to follow along, be sure you download this and install it. Alright, so now we can get started. Let's make a new composition. I will use HDTV 1080p, and I will use 90 frames as duration. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do is create a light. I will use a point light. I will leave this named as light 1, 100% intensity, hit OK. And I will go to position, so P for position, and let's just center this. So 960, 540 and 0. This will place our light right in the center of the scene. And now if I go to my utility box, I can go to my clones tab over here, and I want to create a radial array of clones, and I want to use a number of 12, and let's say the range, it doesn't really matter, but I will use a range of 600 just as a starting point, and then I can click create and exit this. So this is the only part you will need utility box for. If you can get to this point without utility box, then you can follow from here. And let's just switch this to layer name. And here you can see now I've just created a radial array of 12 lights. And here we have null parent, which all of the lights are parented to, and I will actually delete the original light, so I don't need this. I can delete this. And what I can do with this is actually, if I go to my radial group null object, I can go to press S on your keyboard for scale, and I can create a scale animation. So I will go to frame, let's say frame 50, and I will increase the scale right until the sort of like the lights leave the screen, so go outside of the scene screen. And I can set the keyframe for the scale here, and then I will go to frame 0 and set a keyframe for 0. Alright, so now you can see the lights are sort of pushing out from the center of the screen, which is great. And we can do some other animation. If I go to my radial group and press R for rotation, I can set a simple time expression for this. So if I Alt and left click the stopwatch for rotation, I can set an expression, and I will type time multiplied by 100. And now you can see because the null is sort of like rotating, this is causing all of the lights to rotate, and it's creating sort of like this pushing out rotating animation. And one other thing I want to do here with the lights is, if I go to my costume view, the one, you can kind of see it from this angle, and I sort of want to offset the Z position of the lights, and I will grab all of my lights. So make sure you don't also select the radial group null object, and with all of my lights selected, I can press P, and then I can set a keyframe. Let's actually move these keyframes to the beginning of the timeline, and let's say at around frame 40, I sort of want to offset their Z value, let's say by around 1000. It doesn't have to be exact. And now what we've created is sort of like they're pushing out, also coming towards the center, towards the camera, and they're also rotating. Alright, so this is sort of like the basis of the animation that is going to be used to drive our particles. Alright, so now we can go back to my active camera view, and I can go to layer, and let's make a solid. Let's name this particular base. And now I can go to Trapcode Particular, and right away I want to go inside the options over here and set the light name starts with. I will set this to be light, so now it will recognize our light layers. Hit OK. And if I go to emitter, I can set this to be type to lights. And now you can see it's sort of following our lights, and everything works as it should. So right away I want to set the velocity to 0, 0, 0, 0. All of these values I want to be set to 0. I also want to stop emitting particles around where the particles leave the screen. So maybe I will stop emitting them at around frame 50. Let's set a keyframe for particles per second, and I know I want 1000 particles. So I will set a keyframe for 1000 particles at frame 15. And let's go to frame, let's say 35, and set this to 0, right? So they stop emitting, and I can also go to particle and set the life to around a value of 2, right? So now you can see they're sort of disappearing. Let's actually leave this at 3, just because I want them to stick around in the center over here. Alright, so far it's looking good, and let's actually set the size to 2 for now. And now I can go to physics, and if I go to air and go to turbulence field, I can set the effect position. So I'm just gonna use some random values that I sort of eyeball over here. And so this should be fine for now. I'm not really concerned about the settings right now. I want to first go to aux system, or auxiliary system, and I will set the emit to be continuously. So what this basically does is it's going to take every particle that has been emitted, and it's going to leave a trail of particles behind it, sort of. And now if I set the size, let's set the size for 1 for now. I'll set the opacity to 100. Color from main I will also set to 100. And I want to set the life to 2. And I want to set the particles per second. Let's try a 25. So you can see the more I increase this value, it sort of fills in the gaps over here. So maybe 40. Let's try 50. Should be good. We can always just go back and change them. And let's see what else we got over here. I will also set the physics, the turbulence position. Let's use 100 for this. So 100 works, and you can see if I scroll through my timeline, because the particles sort of get more displaced because of the turbulence field, this will generate more interesting shapes, and just sort of create our final organic form that you've seen in the preview. So first of all, I know I need a little more displacement going around, so let's actually change the turbulence field effect position value to 350. Alright, so that's a little better, and I want to go to my spherical field, and I want to set this to be negative, maybe negative 30. And what this does basically is if I turn on visualize fields, you can kind of see there's a blue line going on in the middle over here. And actually if I set the radius to be higher, so let's try a radius of 500. Now you can kind of see the particles are being sort of like sucked in towards the center over here, and that's gonna create a really interesting effect. So I'm just increasing the radius to 800, and I want the feather to be 100. And I can turn off visualize fields, see what's going on. And let's actually try a negative 50 value. So now the problem is that you can kind of see we have some weird jaggy lines over here going on that they don't really make any sense with the rest of the particles. So this is actually because we have the original particles that are being generated. We don't actually need to see these. So one way that you can do this is if you set the size or opacity to 0. So I will set the size to 0, and you can see this sort of gets rid of the original particles that were generated. So let's see what else we can do over here. If I go to my aux system, let's actually set the opacity maybe to 50. And let's set the transfer mode to add. And let's actually give it some colors. So for color, you will have to go to your particle settings and set the color to whatever you want. Let's actually use sort of like bright orange for this. So I will hit OK. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Let's actually make this a little more red. So that's a little too much yellow for my taste. Alright, this looks fine. And let's actually just create a camera now. And I can, let's just use another frame here that loads a little faster. So I can now orbit around. So I'm pressing C, by the way, to switch between camera tools. So you can press C and switch between move, zoom, and orbit. So you just want to orbit around a bit, just sort of show the depth of the particles more. Pick a nice interesting angle over here. So this seems to work. So you can see as I'm scrubbing through the timeline that because there's a lot of movement, it creates more interesting patterns. And actually, in the original example that I've actually slowed down the particles. So once they reached like a state that was pretty interesting, I didn't want them to go beyond sort of like aesthetic comprehension. So what I did was set a keyframe for physics time factor, and then I went like five frames ahead, and I can set a keyframe for like maybe 0.5. So this will slow down our particles movement by half, and now you can see they sort of stop moving so chaotically, which just leaves us with the nice interesting shape. So I actually want to set the opacity, or the size actually. I want to set this to be just a little smaller, just so it's not that bright. So maybe 0.8. Alright, and now I can use this layer and duplicate this layer. And I can set this layer to add. And I will also set this to add. And let's actually turn this off for now. And let's make a fast background layer. So I will just use a ramp, generate ramp. Let's use a radial ramp. Let's set this to be like a dark blue and black. Adjust these settings a bit. Let's turn on one of these layers, see what we get. So maybe something like this. Alright, this looks pretty fine. And let's see what we can do with the duplicated layer. I will solo this. And I want to use this sort of like a highlight layer. So I will add a curves adjustment to this. And I can go to alpha channel. And I can just sort of like filter out the highlights. And I will turn this, I will unsolo this. And I can just add a glow just for this layer. So what I'm essentially doing is sort of filtering out the highlights and adding glow just to the highlights. So if I turn this off, you can kind of see we're really turning up the highlights, and with the glow it just creates a more interesting effect. And another thing that I did in the original example was I duplicated this layer, and I will actually solo this, and let's actually rename this to particular sprite, or actually just particular small. And now for this layer I can go to my particles per second, and let's actually set this to be 100, and let's go to aux, and let's set the particles per second to be 20. Alright, so I'm creating the same sort of effect, just with a lot less particles, or maybe that's even too many. So let's actually set this to 10. Alright, so that's sort of like what I'm going for. And if I set the size now to be 1.4 for the aux, you can kind of see we are using the original layer that we had to sort of create some variating particles on top of our composition. And I want to set the color for this to be sort of like a bluish color. So maybe something like this. I think these are too many particles. And let's actually set the particles per second to be 50. Right, so something like this. And if I unsolo this, let's see how they overlay. Alright, so it's very noticeable. Let's actually go to Effect, Stylize, and add a couple of glows. So I added a glow, and now I can Control D to duplicate this glow. Now we'll set the glow radius for the second glow to be higher. And let's actually go back to the color over here, and let's use just a different color, something a little brighter, maybe towards white. Alright, so now you can see them. And I actually want to go back to my original layers, and let's set the color for the original layer to be sort of like a little darker maybe. And let's set the size to be smaller, 0.7. And let's set the size for the second layer to be smaller also. So I don't want the original layers to be this bright. So maybe 0.6 over here. Maybe 0.7. Alright, so something like this. And I will actually set this to be a little towards red as well, so more orange. So maybe something like this. And let's unsolo this. Alright, so now we can see our new particles more clearly. The problem is that they are still too many, I think, so I can set this to be 30. Let's see. Alright, that's a little better. Let's actually set the scale to be 1. So I don't want it to be that big. And I can then duplicate this layer again, and I will solo this layer. And I want to use even less particles for this, so let's use 15 particles per second. And for auxiliary, let's use 6. So now I have I'm generating even less particles, and I can set these to be a higher size. So now if I use a size of 1.5 or so, and let's change the color to be brighter, more towards white. So now I have added another, let's actually rename this to particular big. Right, so now I have added another layer of particles to sort of like create some more interesting variations. And let's see, in our original example, so it's coming pretty close. You just have to animate the camera orbit, and let's actually see how we can create some interesting depth of field blur. And I will add a new white solid layer, and I will turn this off for now. And I want to create a mask over here on this corner, and I will also create another mask over here on the other side. And now I can turn this back on, and I can press F for a feather. And now I can increase the feather of these masks. So maybe something like this. Let's actually increase the feather even more. So sort of where this white is will dictate how the blur is applied. And now I can Control-Shift-C to pre-compose this layer. And I will turn this off. And now I can add a new adjustment layer. And I can go to Stylize, oh no, actually Blur and Sharpen. Let's go for Camera Lens Blur. And let's set the layer to be the layer that we've just created, so white solid comp. And I can increase the blur radius now, and you can see how that sort of affects it. And don't forget to set the repeat edge pixel. Alright, so something like this. Maybe not that much, maybe like a 40, value of 40. So it's looking pretty close. And one final thing that we can do is add the curves. Just sort of brighten this up a bit. And let's actually increase the red a bit. maybe the green highlights. Let's increase the blue shadows, so maybe something like this. And let's add an overall glow to this also. Spread out the radius and maybe decrease the threshold. So maybe something like this. So that's about it. That's how I achieved the original effect. If you want to see exactly how the original effect was laid out and download the project file, you can follow the link in the description of the video. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more tutorials, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.